Just 2 days after Virginia and New Jersey elected women as governors, bringing the tally up to 14 now women governors, which is the most we've had in this country at any given time, the New York Times ran this. They pretty quickly changed the title to this, replacing women with liberal feminism. So as a woman who is a liberal feminist who studies gender, my recommendation is that you not read this article unless you really want to be frustrated, but I'll give you some highlights. This is the transcript of a podcast Ross Douthat did with two conservative women who have actually pretty different ideas about what's wrong with liberal feminism. One of the women, Leah Sargent, seems to make one main argument, at least in this podcast, which is that women working is against our nature, and that's in large part because it forces us to delay marriage and delay childbearing, which is what she sees as our inherent nature. The more provocative, or you might even say wacky things in this podcast come from the other guest, a woman named Helen Andrews, who's the former managing editor of the Washington Examiner. She makes a lot of arguments that I don't think are in alignment with reality. For example, she talks about an essay that she's published called The Great Feminization. I did also read that essay. Again, I would not recommend unless you would like to be very frustrated. But in that essay and in this podcast, she talks about some key things that she sees as problematic in our modern day workplaces, specifically because of women. One argument she makes is that feminization is the cause of what she calls wokeness. It's hard to know exactly what she means by wokeness, but an example that she gives is around the MeToo movement and this idea she has that the MeToo movement made it such that everyone was forced to believe all women. And I don't know if she's heard of people like Amber Heard, for example, but that argument does not hold water. She also seems to interpret wokeness as shutting down conversations, and I'm not sure if she knows who's behind book bans. She also seems to have some sense that masculinity is like outlawed in workplaces. As a woman surgeon who's worked in a very obviously male-dominated profession for my entire career, I don't understand how anyone who has worked in the real world could come to that conclusion. She actually argues that the only reason there are so many women in professions like medicine and the law is because anti-discrimination laws have, as she puts it, put a thumb on the scale, making it such that women who at some point she suggests are not qualified are getting access to spaces because of anti-discrimination laws specifically. She also argues both in terms of anti-discrimination in general and specifically with regard to Title IX that men are essentially not being treated fairly in our workplaces. As someone who until very recently was funded by the NIH to study sexual harassment, as someone who teaches a course on campus sexual assault, as someone who has actually worked in the real world for many years now, I genuinely cannot wrap my head around this argument. In fact, she implies specifically that Title IX cases are somehow heavily biased toward the survivors who bring them, when famously, anyone who actually studies Title IX has seen and talks about how Title IX repeatedly fails survivors. And if this woman were just saying all of this in her essay in some lesser known outlet and not being interviewed for a New York Times podcast, we would not be sitting here talking about it. But as I have mentioned on my podcast with my colleague, Dr. Alyssa Burgart, views like this that used to be fringe, used to not get airtime in the so-called paper of record, are now continuing to become more and more mainstream. And you can tell how far these arguments are from reality when Ross Douthat is the one who is the closest thing to a voice of reason in this conversation. He multiple times tries to push back against what's being said to him, like when Helen Andrews suggests that women aren't suited for the workplace because what we do is gossip and we avoid confrontation. And in fact, the feminization of workplaces undermines the rule of law. And she also argues multiple times that women undermine the seeking of truth, essentially. And Ross says, okay, but don't we have lots of examples in history of regimes and organizations led by men who were also not truthful and did not present an accurate view of what they had experienced or what had happened. Another example of this is when I believe it was Leah Sargent who suggested that women don't really want to work and it's against our nature to work. And Ross said, but women choose to repeatedly. Many women are choosing to, and many women are choosing to place careers above family. So doesn't that go against your argument? For me, as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about these issues, it was somewhat interesting to read from an academic perspective what the modern arguments are against women in the workplace. And I think we all would have been better off without giving a platform to these regressive views in a time when one of our two parties is actively trying to roll back women's rights, with multiple people this week talking about repealing the 19th Amendment because so many women voted for Democratic candidates in the election on Tuesday.